welcome to our third lecture on our series of the history and development of ideas in East Asian medicine. So today we're going to look at the Zhou dynasty, which is one of the most ancient dynasties. It comes right after the Shang dynasty, which we looked at in our last lecture. And the Zhou dynasty is a very important dynasty. It's actually a very long and important dynasty, which sets the blueprint and the imprint for a lot of Chinese culture afterwards. So many of the foundational ideas and patterns and models of what we come to understand and think of as Chinese culture, and to a larger extent maybe East Asian culture, as well as East Asian medicine, originate and come from the Zhou dynasty. It's kind of like the seed of the culture, if you will. And so it's a really important time period to kind of just understand and have a basic understanding of, because this is going to influence some of the major ideas and philosophies which are going to really characterize Chinese culture and East Asian culture and society and the medicine as a whole. So let's jump into our lecture, and we're just going to talk about the Zhou dynasty and demonological medicine. So just as a quick overview, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Zhou dynasty, and then an important concept called the mandate of heaven. Maybe we'll talk about a little bit of how the Zhou dynasty influences culture and history as a whole. We're going to examine some of the socio-realities of the time and how they change over the period of the Zhou dynasty. We're also going to look briefly at a few of the important texts of that period, and we're also going to examine what we call demonological medicine, which is sort of the next stage of the pluralism of East Asian medicine, which emerges out of the Zhou dynasty and the historical time period and the reality of that time. And we're going to look at how that influences acupuncture and East Asian medicine to this day. So just briefly, we're going to look at this map. This is the Zhou dynasty here. It's kind of the main breadbasket of China. This is the agricultural area of China. And the Zhou dynasty, which is from 1045 to 221 BC, saw China grow, fracture into states, and then unite in imperialism. It was technically the longest dynasty, although the Zhou dynasty had effectively lost power by 770 BC. Some of the major philosophies and religions emerged that were the basis of Chinese beliefs in later eras, such as Confucianism and Taoism. And just that fact alone is why the Zhou dynasty is really important in the history, because these fundamental philosophies which underlie so much of East Asian medicine, really, this is their nascent stage. This is the seed of their development, and it takes place in the Zhou dynasty. So the Zhou dynasty, as we just saw from that map, it originates in northwest China, and they had developed very considerably advanced agricultural skills. So they developed this system of communally managed irrigation systems, kind of in like square grids, and this created a productive advantage over the Shang, which were their rivals. And so this system, in some ways, it parallels kind of the way that the European feudal system and like the fief system was set up in feudal Europe. So we might think about it as just like just an example, because that's more familiar sometimes to Western history, or our ideas of Western history. But in many ways, the Zhou continued the ancestor worship practices of their Shang predecessors, and they developed also their own novel cultural innovations, which have hugely profound impacts on all of Chinese history, Chinese culture, and East Asian culture in general. This reverberates out throughout history and into the culture even to this day. Their innovations and their developments, their cultural innovations. And that's what Unschild says in our Medicine in China text as we read through this chapter on the Zhou dynasty and demonological medicine. So just for a minute, I want to touch on this concept of the mandate of heaven. So the mandate of heaven, it's an ancient Chinese philosophical concept which expresses the legitimacy of rulers. So, for instance, when the Shang dynasty fell to the Zhou dynasty and a new dynasty was initiated and emerges, the transfer of the political power which took place, you can understand it through the lens of the mandate of heaven in some ways, because as it passed on from the Shang to the Zhou dynasty, the mandate changes hands. And now the Zhou are considered the legitimate rulers of the realm. And so, just to kind of put this into perspective, this concept of the mandate of heaven, what this means is essentially that in ancient China, there is this conception that the great deity Shangdi, basically like the god of the world. It's like the primordial deity, the ultimate spiritual power of the world in ancient China. This is what bestows the favor upon an emperor. So this is the heavenly mandate, which gives them the right to rule over all of China, which is essentially at this period of time basically the whole world. Um, so what that means is that there is a deity or a spirit or some kind of spiritual authority which is the one that in the minds of the people gives legitimacy to a regime or a government or ruler. And so, if catastrophic events happen during a time period like wars or famines or pandemics, this can be seen by people or people in the government or people around the emperor as these are like inauspicious signs. These are bad omens. These might reflect on the possibility that heaven's mandate is waning for this emperor. Uh, and on the inverse, if the opposite of that, if it's a good time, if good times prevail, then this is like, hey, the emperor has the mandate of heaven. It's well understood. People are happy, and so this is an important concept because throughout time and history, this cycle keeps repeating where uh, an empire falls and is often described as being ruling in bad ways. You know, they are perhaps not behaving the way that they should and not taking care of the empire the way they should. Maybe they're engaging in selfish acts. Maybe the empire or the emperor himself is spending the money of the empire in licentious activities, immoral ways. Maybe he's engaging in wars and conscripting people to fight in wars against neighbors to try to take more territory. Or maybe he is just generally not paying attention to the civilization and the infrastructure is decaying or going bad, or he didn't do the right things to make sure there was enough food in the granaries and stored away. And now, because perhaps there's a shortage in the grain that year, people are starving to death or getting sick. There's a famine. Maybe there's a pandemic that breaks out. All these kinds of things can be seen as maybe inauspicious, bad signs, and could be interpreted as potentially these are like punishments and signs that the heavenly mandate and the mandate of heaven that's bestowed upon this emperor, maybe the whole dynasty, is waning. So this is kind of the reality, the socio-reality of how power is legitimized. So I'd say the most important way that this kind of evolves from the time of the Shang dynasty to the Zhou dynasty is that rather just kind of this unassailable heavenly order that is just chosen without any participation of the people involved, like it was for the Shang dynasty, because it's all matters of the spiritual realm, it's matters of God, it's matters of they are the ones who put into order the mandate of heaven. What happens with the Zhou dynasty is it kind of shifts to a mandate based on virtue. Okay, so this quote says, while for the Shang people, both the spirits and their ancestors and the high god were deities, and the Shang rulers were only executioners of the will of these deities. what happened is the Zhou took away from the spirits of their own ancestors this aura of numinosity, and at the same time, it demystified the role of heaven and that of themselves. So heaven acted like a supreme ruler whose executioners the Zhou were. So they kind of flipped it on its head. And so their way of government by virtue was ordered by heaven, which therefore had also its principles of virtue. These could be only be brought into the world by a dynasty ruling by means of virtue. So the Zhou rulers thus alleged to simply obey the orders of heaven, punish the Shang for their rule without virtue, and they took over the empire. And so this changes things because it's not just out of our control whether somebody has the mandate of heaven. It's about conforming their rule to the heavenly way, to the order of the universe, to what is good and what is right and what is virtuous. And if people did that, then order would prevail, harmony would prevail, people would be have a good life, and society would be peaceful. And if the emperor and the empire was not run in that fashion, and if it was run in a bad way, then bad things would happen, and everything would go bad, and all of those things that we were talking about just before would likely happen, and this would be interpreted as the mandate of heaven is waning because the person is not behaving the right way. The emperor is not doing his duties, essentially. And so it really became just a facet of doing the right thing. And even beyond just government and governing and how to organize society as a whole, you can kind of extrapolate this concept of right conduct and right behavior. And this sort of lays the foundation for how the medicine is conceived of East Asian medicine, because as time passes and the medical ideas evolve, even beyond the Zhou dynasty in many cases, what you end up finding is that health is more of a function of upright, moral, virtuous, proper behavior in the world. If you behave the wrong way, you're more likely to get sick. And so, as the philosophy slowly evolves from more of a shamanistic and spirit world centered philosophy, we start to enter into the Zhou dynasty, which is kind of like the initiation of this moral, virtuous rule and governance. And during this evolution, it changes the medicine too, as we move to a more naturalistic philosophy, and ultimately, we arrive at concepts like qi and yin and yang, et cetera, et cetera. One thing I like to point out is that the victors write history. So when the Zhou dynasty took over from the Shang, they wrote the books, they wrote the history, and so they framed the Shang dynasty as sort of as a degenerate or bad ruling, and they lost the mandate of heaven. And the Zhou dynasty, of course, are the virtuous ones, and they deserve the mandate of heaven. And so it's often the case that as any new dynasty emerges, they make sure to give the people who regard they make the new dynasty make sure it gives the people who many regard it as the usurpers a glowing biography. This is to consolidate their power. This way, they're not seen as usurpers. They want to be seen as legitimate rulers. They want their coup, as it is. They're basically pulling off a coup and taking over the government and taking over the power, and they want that to be seen as a proper thing. They want that to be seen as legitimate in the eyes of all of the people. And so they frame it in such a way as the old emperor and the old rulers were bad, and the new ones are virtuous, and the new ones are good. So there is an element of that is a certain convenience of that, because it helps you establish your power too. So I just think that's interesting to also keep in the backs of our minds, because this is a common thing throughout all East Asian and Chinese world history. Is the winners are shown as the good guys, basically. So some of the important cultural figures of the Zhou dynasty, we have King Wen. King Wen's like the original Zhou dynasty founder, in a sense. He's the father, and he's given the honorable titles of King and Wen, which is the word for culture, by King Wu. Now, King Wu is the second son of King Wen, and he is the one who actually founds the Zhou dynasty and finishes the war against the Shang and finally wins and overtakes it, and he establishes the Zhou dynasty like officially. And then the third figure that's important is the Duke of Zhou. And so uh, when King Wu dies, this is only a few years after he founds the Zhou dynasty, which is, that's a pretty precarious situation. You just take over the whole political establishment, you take over the country, and then you die a few years later. It's like, that could throw a lot of things into chaos, right? And so what happens is his heir apparent is too young to take over the throne. So his brother, who's the Duke of Zhou, he acts as regent to the empire, and he protects the thrones from usurpers. He defends against rebellions, and then he abdicates the throne to the true heir when he comes of age. So he's very highly regarded by Confucian scholars because they see this as very extremely virtuous behavior. And so the reason I just want to mention this is because this is kind of a perfect example of how the Zhou dynasty is sort of hailed as this virtual dynasty, partly because of the acts of these individuals who are hailed as kind of the cultural exemplars of the Zhou and the heroes, and especially the Duke of Zhou with these very, very virtuous acts. And this story is just seen as a really virtuous thing to do because it would have been a simple thing as an adult, fully functional human being to just take the power for himself. He was in that position where he had the political power in his hands, and instead of just taking the power, he could have, because he could have easily usurped the power from that child who was too young and was vulnerable and could not really, do anything to establish his reign because he didn't come of age yet. He could have just taken that power. He could have become the emperor for himself. He could have ended up being the main guy in the story. But instead of doing that, he did what is considered the virtuous thing, and he actually, protected the power and then handed it over peacefully to the rightful heir when he came of age. So this is an important story because this is in stark contrast to the state of affairs that over time, as the Zhou dynasty starts to decline and wane and go into chaos, the state of affairs of the time period descends into the absolute opposite of this virtuous situation of like, this unbelievably morally exemplary person who, instead of taking power for himself, hands the power to the rightful heir, does the right thing, behaves in the right proper way. Whereas later, everyone is vying for power, backstabbing, murdering, stealing, and that becomes the state of the age at the end of the Zhou dynasty. So it's just important to know that because also this is like the pattern. This is the exemplar of the future philosophies of perhaps Confucianism. He looks back to the Zhou dynasty. He looks back to these people as models of virtue, and so knowing that this is the model and the basis for that whole philosophy is important later when we talk about Confucianism in a later lecture. So just as an example about that, Confucius idolized the Zhou as the ideal model. Here's two quotes from the Analects of Confucius, which is like the main book for Confucianism and the sayings of Confucius. He says, "The Zhou gazed down upon the two dynasties that preceded it. How brilliant in culture it is! I follow the Zhou." So he's just like, the Zhou dynasty is like the pinnacle of culture. They're the best. And then he also says, "How seriously have I declined? It's been so long since I last dreamt of meeting the Duke of Zhou." So he's just like lamenting about how, he would dream about this Duke of Zhou, and it's been so long since he's had a dream where he met his hero, the Duke of Zhou, the exemplar of the Zhou dynasty. So it just goes to show how Confucius looks back in his philosophy to the Zhou dynasty as a model of civilization and a model of order, because not just for how to govern and how to be, how to order society, but also this reflects upon medical ideas because it's like health is a function of order, and disease is a function of chaos and disorder. So it's important in that way. So the cultural influence of the Zhou dynasty is pretty profound because of that very big influence that it has on Confucius, and that it sets the tone for basically just empires and imperial dynasties going forward. I just want to comment that one of the most important texts is the I Ching which comes out during like the Zhou dynasty. That's the Book of Changes, and we're going to talk about that more in a bit. There's also this introduction of the idea of virtue. It's like also the model of how to behave, and the rituals of society are kind of set down in the Zhou dynasty. And these are the types of things that Confucius looks back to as models. And so then you have also, just to speak about the I Ching real quick, this is also kind of another evolution of the divination methods that we talked about in our last lecture with the Shang dynasty. So divination remains an important feature of Chinese society and how to make decisions. But maybe instead of asking the spirits in the way that the oracles were doing it before with like oracle bones, they might use the I Ching as an oracle, the Book of Changes instead as an oracle in the Zhou dynasty, because this is sort of where the socio-reality and the philosophy of the times are starting to evolve and change from more of a spirit-based worldview to a natural philosophy worldview. Although I wouldn't say that in the Zhou dynasty this is like has fully taken place. Like all of China has not maybe embraced this yet, but this is kind of where it's going. And the Zhou dynasty and the rulers of the Zhou dynasty are in many ways at the forefront of this, because they're very much, to them, the I Ching is very much an important facet of how they do things. And it becomes like a divination method, because the I Ching is a way of understanding how the transformations of things, the changes in things. It is a book that helps you to understand how the universe is changing. At least that's the idea of it. And so in that way, it's very much a divination method. It's just more of a natural philosophy divination method rather than one that's relying on maybe like contact with spirits. This culture of the Zhou dynasty, like I said before, it's revered by Confucius, sets up the moral cultural precedent and standard, or the prototype. It's like the correct, upright way to govern and live and order human society. And then it also kind of is the origin of ideas like yin and yang, wu xing, the five phases. These kind of ideas, they're still nascent, but they start to develop and evolve during the time period of the Zhou dynasty. So all these natural philosophy ideas are starting to emerge slowly and percolate under the surface. Some of the important texts from the Zhou dynasty, just to throw these out, because they're not maybe the most important books for medicine, but they're important to note just briefly, because they're important to society and culture and how the society evolves. These are considered like the classics of Confucianism. These important books from the Zhou dynasty. So you have the classic of poetry. It's a collection of poems and folk songs, festival songs, hymns, eulogies. You have the Book of Documents, which is a collection of documents and speeches. It's possibly the oldest Chinese narrative. The Book of Rites describes very ancient rites and rituals and ceremonies. And then you have the I Ching itself, which is an important book, not only as a divination system, but a way to understand the natural cycles of the natural world. It uses the trigrams and hexagrams and the concepts of yin and yang. It's also important for acupuncture theories and the meridians and acupuncture points, and it continues to be an influential component of the medicine as we go. And then we have the Spring and Autumn Annals, which is a historical record of the state of Lu, which is where Confucius is from. There's also the classic of music, but it's been lost. So these are like the classic books that, when Confucius says we look back to the Zhou or the Zhou, that like he's talking about the culture that's contained within these ancient texts, these records of how the Zhou dynasty operated. That's part of it. The books are important. So just another thing about the I Ching, it sets up a cosmology. This is where we're evolving towards. And cosmology is a branch of metaphysics that deals with the nature of the universe. It's a theory or doctrine describing the natural order of the universe. So this is like a book that is describing how the universe works. It's describing how things change over time, how things change into one another, and the cycles of that. The cycles, it's a natural philosophy. It's the cycles of how yin and yang are transforming into one another. It's the cycles of how chi is transforming. It explains things like the changing of the weather and the changing of the seasons. It explains things like how just situations transform into new situations. So it makes it possible, this book, for a rational and naturalistic conception of medicine to eventually emerge, rather than just the empirical and magical spirit world aspects of the medicine, which we looked at a little bit in the Shang with ancestor worship, and which we're going to explore as we go in this lecture here with the demonological medicine. But this is just to point out the evolution of how we're, as we move through the spiritual ancestor demonological ideas, we're slowly shifting into a natural philosophy. And this picture is an example of what we call the trigrams. There's 8 of them, which is the bagua. These are the gua, and these are broken and unbroken lines, which represent yin and yang. So for instance, for kun, earth, this is like yin, yin, yin. And then for gun, mountain, this is like yang, yin, yin. So for example, if you do that with these combinations of yin and yang, you come up with 8 different combinations, and these are the trigrams. And in the I Ching, they would actually put 2 trigrams together, so you can actually make 60 combinations of the trigrams, and so you have 60 hexagrams. But basically, this is how they explain different possible transformations of qi. There's 60 different possibilities, and they move in cycles, and they transform into one another. And the I Ching, the book, and the theory of it is that you can have an idea and use reason and logic and the system of the book to understand what the situation is and where it's transforming, or where it might transform to. So just a reminder, this is where we are now in the Zhou dynasty. We have the Western Zhou, which is like these main characters. It's the good times, the high times of the Zhou. Then we have the Eastern Zhou, the second half, and this is like the not so good times. Now things are declining and they're starting to wane, and this is also referred to as the spring and autumn period. And then towards the very end, the warring states period, because as the Zhou dynasty loses its power and it becomes just a figurehead and it creates this giant power vacuum, all of a sudden order disintegrates into chaos. There's fighting and civil war and bloodshed, and there becomes a fragmentary slew of different states which are vying for supremacy in China. And it basically becomes centuries of bloody warfare where there is no legitimate recognized ruler over the realm. There is no unification. It's just civil war and fighting for hundreds of years. And that's called the Warring States period, which is an important period because during the Warring States period, you have the emergence of all of these natural philosophies like Confucianism and Taoism, and there's other ones like legalism and Mohism. And they are traveling around, these philosophers, to the courts of these different states, and they're trying to influence the rulers, and they're trying to tell them to follow their philosophies, because if they do so, it will bring order to the lands and it will bring order to the realms. And so there's this large philosophical competition of ideas that's taking place, and this is when some of the most fruitful ideas of philosophy and culture emerge out of this time period of the Warring States period. So out of this chaos, it's like out of this crazy civil war strife and chaos emerges some of the most important philosophies of that will go down to influence all of Chinese culture up to the present, and as well as our medicine, because Confucianism and Taoism, as we will learn in our subsequent lessons, are extremely foundational to East Asian medicine. But just a reminder, we're right here still. We're right at the very beginning, okay? So we're going to get more into some of those philosophies when we get down into this blue section. So now we're in the end of the Zhou dynasty, the Eastern Zhou. And it's a pivotal moment. There's an unrest, and it destabilizes their control. They're forced to move their capital to the east. They become dependent on their vassals, and leaders of other states begin crowning themselves as kings. This is the spring and autumn period. It's the period of decline, and eventually, as their power wanes, the Zhou become largely ceremonial figurehead rulers. And now this is the next socio-reality transformation over this long Zhou dynasty period that occurs. So we go from the Shang dynasty, where it's a socio-reality of ancestor worship and veneration and spirits. Then we go to the founding of the Zhou dynasty, where everything is mediated by virtue. It's a government of virtue ethics. It's a it's a world governed by virtuous conduct. And as that disintegrates and falls apart, what you have is the world devolve into an ethics of power. And so, uh, as an example of this, when the Zhou dynasty were victorious over the Shang, they allowed all the surviving nobles to live. They provided them land. They let them continue to govern as vassals to the emperor. And they retained the means to continue to make the necessary sacrificial offerings for their ancestors. This speaks to the continuation of ancestor veneration and honor even among enemy families at the time. Many of the cultural aspects of Shang culture were continued by the Zhou, but often in new novel forms. This is reflected in the virtuous features which became characteristic of the cultural leaders of the Zhou, and that are honored by future generations and philosophers such as Confucius. However, this practice was not continued with the subsequent fall of the Zhou dynasty, because there was just a different ethics, a different socio-reality at play. The old conventions became meaningless. Each side sought total triumph. The ultimate objective was to destroy the enemy, a goal that in earlier times would have been impossible. The ethics of power gradually displaced the old morality of honor and moderation. So this is really just a period of total war. There's no rules, there's no honor, there's no loyalty. It's just a winner takes all situation, you know. And so this informs how people, I think, behaved in the world generally. You know, it was a breakdown of the moral and ethical order of the whole civilization. It's a period of strife and war. And so from this point on until the unification of the empire in 221 BC, China was plagued by an almost uninterrupted series of wars and hostilities among individual states already present in the 8th century BC. Newly formed political entities in outlying areas and foreign peoples who staged occasional invasions. The already chaotic situation was exacerbated by countless cases of patricide, uxoricide, fratricide within the many ruling families. So this moral decay marks the decline of the Zhou dynasty as one of the bloodiest periods in all of Chinese history. So compare that statement with what we just saw with the Duke of Zhou. So the Duke of Zhou was this moral, amazing man, and then now we have fratricide, patricide. We have sons and fathers killing each other, brothers killing each other, etc., etc. The vibe has shifted. So this is this kind of socio-reality developments that we're thinking about. So just consider how would one socio-reality have been conditioned by the rise and the fall of the Zhou dynasty, knowing this stuff. So you're being influenced by new cultural philosophical ideas that are emerging, the emergence of these natural philosophies. There's the reverence of cultural heroes who represent virtuous living and ruling. There's the ensuing moral, political, cultural breakdown of society, all the waning power of the Zhou, the power vacuum. There's the brutal realities of this endless strife and civil warfare. There's violence, betrayal, subterfuge, loss of familial loyalty, hundreds of years of it. And there's this shift from government by virtue to an ethics of power. So let's see, this quote here by Han Feize, who's a legalist philosopher, which is kind of a very authoritarian school of philosophy, which is vying for philosophical relevance during this time. He says, when a person falls ill, it means he has been injured by a demon. This to me is an interesting quote, because Han Feize is not a doctor. He's just a philosopher. He's a political philosopher. And he makes this comment in his book, which is about political philosophy, which to me is just representative of what somebody thinks at this time, that he would not be a doctor but still have this view of how illness is operating. So it just goes to show that at this time period, where these in this warring states scenario, the people commonly would see illness uh, and sickness as a function of a demon, and a spirit, a demon has attacked them. So this is why we're going to talk about demonological medicine. The medical ideas that gained acceptance among broad segments of the population were those that can be viewed as an immediate consequence of contemporary political conditions and social structures. These are the concepts of demonic medicine. An obvious change in the attitude towards the non-living members of the earthly community resulted in a diminished significance of ancestors and a concomitant perception of demons as partially or even completely responsible for everyday misfortune, including illness. The once well-ordered relationships and system of communication between living beings and the world of deities and spirits had at first fallen into a state of great confusion and finally had broken down completely. So this is the transformation from this Shang dynasty conception of, some kind of a harmonious relationship with the spirit world to now the people are just under attack. They're under spiritual attack. There's spiritual demonic warfare going on and attacking them. There are malicious spirits. There are demons. This is not a matter of just, venerating your ancestors. You are under attack by a frenzy of demonic influences. It is a different situation. Let's just comment briefly on these ideas of the Hun and the Po. So the Po is like the corporeal body is present in the body from birth and perishes along with the body following death. It's kind of a yin thing. It's heavy. It's tied to the lungs and the jing and the bones and the flesh. The ethereal soul is the Hun. Enters the body after birth. Sometimes when you're sleeping or unconscious, it might leave the body. After you die, it wanders alone through space-time. It's considered to be yang, airy, mobile, linked to the liver and the blood. So with demonic medicine, it perceives these unattached souls, spirits, or demons as being inherently evil, and they're thus constantly striving to harm man. So there's evil spirits that can wander around and possess you. There's evil spirits that can enter your body and cause disease. And these are going to be important terms because we're going to look at some of the ways that demonological medicine manifests in the actual medical ideas of East Asian medicine in just a minute. So, malicious spirits. The assumption of well-meaning or indifferent spirits is quite possible. The assumption of a permanently malicious character in these beings is fostered by a social climate that prevails in China only after 771 BC, which is the beginning of the end of the Zhou dynasty. So this is the all against all socio-reality, which reflects the general uncertainty and existential angst associated with the times, the disintegrating culture. All the institutions have become bankrupt and degenerate, and there is no order, there is no virtue in the land. There's just civil war and strife and famine and murder. There's brigands and bandits and gangs roaming. And inevitably, this perhaps bleeds into the demonological, medical, socio-reality of the times. And it influences the way that people saw reality. And it went from some kind of a good or neutral relationship that they had with spirits and ancestors to a extremely hostile relationship where they feel like they are under attack and it's relentless. It's inevitable, even. So the central thesis of demonic medicine is that illness and suffering are natural and unavoidable. That's important to point out because this is a little bit in conflict with what we think of as the natural philosophy that emerges, which I've been kind of touching on. This is in counter to the medicine of systematic correspondence. That's what Unschuld is going to call what we kind of come to know as like East Asian medicine ideas proper, like yin and yang and qi and blood and hot and cold and the various environmental influences and the way that Everything in the world can be systematized and explained and corresponds to things like water to the kidneys or spleen to the earth. Those are all examples of the medicine of systematic correspondence, which we're going to get into in a very near future lesson. But it's a different idea fundamentally because it's emerging from naturalistic philosophies and different dynamics and different worldviews, which are related to like Taoism and the Neijing, which is like Huangde and Lao Tzu and Confucianism, and these philosophies of Yin and Yang and Wuxing, which are influenced by the I Ching and this high elegant Zhou culture. And so, whereas demonic and demonological medicine is saying, hey, illness and disease is inevitable, you're going to get it because there are hostile, malicious demons out there that are going to try to invade you and possess you. The medicine of systematic correspondence would counter and say, well, no, actually, illness isn't necessarily inevitable because we can change the way that we behave and our practices, and we can act virtuously. And by doing so, we'll be in harmony with the natural world, we'll be in harmony with the natural order, and this will prevent illness. We can maintain health and we can cultivate health and we can do things correctly and live correctly and be healthy and avoid disease. So that's where the tension is between these two different conceptions of medicine as it emerges. So let's look deeper a little bit at some of the concepts of demonological medicine. Number one, you have this idea called Gui. This is like a ghost, an apparition, a spirit, demon, devil. You have these Wu shamans, which we mentioned briefly in our last lecture. The shamanistic tradition is very much involved with exorcisms, and they are there to address possessions and symptoms of possession. So they are in contact with spiritual deities and entities. Their job is to influence them. They want to restrain evil spirits. They want to restrain the Gui that have invaded people and are causing them illness. Then there's also guardian spirits that are associated with warding off and fighting off evil spirits. So you can summon the guardian spirits, and that's one of the ways that the Wu shamans would operate. They could also use things like verbal spells or incantations, something called breath magic. So all of these different ways of influencing the spirits. You would also have talismans, which transfers the written word to a metaphysical destination, according to Unschuld. And here's an example of a talisman. This is a Taoist talisman, just to see one, and it looks like an official document. You would have ecstatic dancing as one example. You know, these are things which might change the state of consciousness. This might create an interaction with the spirit realm, a shamanic, ecstatic state. Magical transfer, which is the transferring of an ailment to an intermediate object, which is then discarded. Amulets, charms, or seals that are used to ward off evil or drive out evil influences or demons. And then, of course, you have medicinal drugs, which can be used to expel or destroy demons in the body. When it comes to Fu Sao talismans and sigils and all of these kinds of things, this is a really interesting book that I recommend about this topic by Benabel Wen. And she goes into this really well and very in depth, and I just think that's a really cool book to check out if this is something that interests you. The amulets, which are also called seals or talismans, were now composed like official documents bringing the world of demons into the administrative hierarchy of imperial bureaucracy. So it's like they're giving commands, they're writing official documents to the and forcing the demons into some kind of a hierarchy. And this is one of the ideas of how we are to influence this spiritual realm. So talismans, they'll contain the likeness or name of influential deities believed to be able to repel evil spirits. And here's an example of a talisman. It's a heavy Taoist charm with a good deal of wear. This charm says, expel evil and send down happiness and good fortune. So these are the kinds of things that would be written down, and by writing them down and making them into a document or writing just the characters it has in the minds of the people of demonological medicine worldview. This has some kind of influence out in the real world. This could, today we might think about this some kind of might have some kind of psychological influence or some kind of other kinds of what we could call magical influence, but maybe there's some psychological element to it. Regardless of how this is working, they saw it as influencing spirits and demons. And then you have exorcisms and possessions. So this is the exorcisms performed by the Wu shamans and the Wu practitioners. Um, this could involve some of the things we just mentioned, like spells, breath techniques, sacrifices, rituals, ecstatic dances. They might use talismans, sigils, etc. And the exorcist or the sufferer himself, he's seeking an alliance with supernatural authorities whose assistance it is hoped will expel or destroy the demons. Possession continues to be utilized as a diagnostic and treatment concept in various forms of East Asian medicine. We can see its influence directly in Worsley 5-element acupuncture protocols. For example, we have the protocol for inner demons and exterior demons. So this is kind of a throwback in that that style of acupuncture attempts to bring back some of the demonological conceptual elements of demonological medicine back into East Asian medicine, because they felt at the time that the systematizing of TCM by the Communist Party of China may have stripped out some of the demonological concepts from the medicine, for better or for worse. And this is a contested, somewhat topic. Some people would say, maybe that didn't happen to the extent that it's claimed, or maybe it's a good thing that it happens, or maybe it's a bad thing that that happens. Regardless, they felt like that was something that happened, and they thought that it is not a good thing. So when J.R. Worsley was creating these protocols, I think what he was thinking about possibly was how to re-inject some of these demonological concepts back into the medicine, and he was using them to come up with these protocols, which are used. And so in some ways, this concept of exorcism and possession is still operative in modern acupuncture protocols. And that's just one example. And so as the Wu shamans, just to give a little etymology, you have two humans here, and they're in between this character for laboring and working. And it's sort of picturing mediators that are situated between heaven and earth. And there's a great Benebell One video on Wu shamanism, which I would recommend. She has a really good YouTube channel. That's the author of that Fu Talisman book. So definitely check out Benebell One's YouTube channel, because she has a lot of really cool, interesting, informative videos which will go further into Wu shamanism and some of the demonological and spiritual medicine concepts. And that's a great resource, so check that out. In the Neijing, Ling Shu, Huangde says, when an incantation results in a cure, how can that be? Chibo responds, the sorcerers of former times, they knew how to overcome all diseases. When they knew the origin of a disease, they were able to perform an incantation and achieve a cure. So this is the ultimate classic of acupuncture. And clearly they have concepts of demonological medicine that are a part of their conception of reality. So this is just an example of that in practice, and how that's shows up even in the most important text of Chinese medicine. Now, speaking of acupuncture, Unschuld says, one additional weapon in the arsenal utilized by Chinese physicians against demons cannot be ignored, and that is acupuncture. An example of this is seen with Sun Simiao and the 13 ghost points, the Gui points. And Sun Simiao lived way later in Chinese history. He's not from the Zhou dynasty, he's from the Sui dynasty, which is kind of like the Tang dynasty period. So this is hundreds and hundreds of years later. But it just goes to show that these demonological concepts persist through time, and they influence the way people think about things and see things, and they influence treatment methods and treatment practices and protocols. So he has a famous protocol called the Ghost Points, and these are 13 acupuncture points that he gives specific new names related to the treatment of ghost issues and ghost diseases and demonological illnesses. And in his very important book, Essential Formulas for Emergencies Worth 1,000 Pieces of Gold, he describes a list of 13 points, 13 ghost points. These should be watched like milk on fire. I imagine that means like really closely. I don't put a lot of milk on fire, but I imagine if you're heating up milk on fire, maybe that it you have to watch it closely because it'll like burn off or something or go bad. Um, that's just I'm just guessing, but he says if these points become weak, then spirits could settle there and sow disorder with the virtuous balance of correct chi. So the needles used to penetrate a demon heart were analogous to the spears used by exorcists at the time of Confucius, when they would run through the streets gesturing in the air with spears, like going like this, stabbing, they're like stabbing spirits and ghosts and demons. And they would do this in order to free the inhabitants from the threat of evil spirits. So Unshold here is just proposing a theory of like maybe this is one of the things that influenced Chinese medicine's acupuncture. Maybe this is one of the things that, you know, gave people the idea to pierce the body with needles. Or this is just a hypothesis, I think, but it's just an interesting way to think about it because this was a shamanic practice where these Wu shamans would go around and stab the air with a spear to kill demons. And so similarly, we're stabbing and piercing the body to either to expel demons in some ways, especially if you're going off the same ideas that were influencing Sun Tzu Miao. Going back to the Hun and Po, you can kind of think as of the Hun and Po as related to ghost diseases. So Hun and Po, they both have that Gui character in their name, in their character, and almost all ghost diseases, which are like Gui Bing, are explained as pathological states of the Hun and the Po. And they are like the doors through which ghosts, spirits, and demons either enter or are expelled. The entire exorcist wing of Chinese medicine, which encompasses things like talismans, ghost points, incantations, and certain types of herbalism, it can be thought of as applied Hun and Po psychology and pathology. Even when modern TCM no longer speaks openly about ghosts, the same point combinations and formulas are still used for things like epilepsy, bipolar mania, PTSD, dissociative states. These were originally designed to treat demonic disruption of the Hun and Po souls. So now let's talk briefly about Xie Qi. And this is the idea of evil, pathogenic, or malicious Qi. And in my mind, this evolves out of the concept of demonological medicine. Another example of how this spirit reality is slowly transforming into the natural philosophy which we use today and which we have come to know of as East Asian medicine. So you have this concept called xie, which is something is xie when it's wrong, evil, depraved, vicious, perverse, heterodox, demonic, iniquitous, nefarious. It's like an unhealthy influence that causes disease in Chinese medicine. It's pathological, it's pathogenic, it's like very not good, it's very bad. Xie Qi is Qi which behaves in opposition to the norms. Qi is supposed to behave a certain way. For example, if it's in conflict with your body's upright Qi, the normal Qi of your system, then it is Xie. And this kind of mirrors the way that Confucius and Confucianism, as we'll see, kind of conceives of things in the world, out in the world as a whole. People should behave a certain way. There's certain proper ways for each individual in society to behave depending on their roles in society. You're supposed to behave a certain way if you're a son or a daughter or a husband or a wife, if you're a ruler, if you're a subject in the empire. Everybody has a certain role to play, and everybody's supposed to behave a certain way according to the moral and ethical conception of Confucianism, the proper way to be. And similarly, in your body, it is also ordered a certain way. And so there are all these different types of qi in the body, and they're supposed to behave a certain way. For example, the stomach qi is supposed to go down. That is a common thing that is said. But if the stomach qi instead goes up, then it's in rebellion. And the stomach qi you might experience nausea or vomiting. So when something is doing the incorrect behavior, when it's doing the wrong thing, when it's acting perversely, that could be called xie qi. Something that is invading from the outside, something that is in rebellion in your body, something that they would call wind an evil wind, or they would call it a robber evil or a robber wind. Something that is causing violence to your system, it's an evil, it's a malicious thing, it's like an inversion of what is correct. So all of those kinds of things are called xie. And in my mind, I think of xie as sort of like evolving out of this demonic medicine idea, but it's sort of being applied in this new naturalistic way with the medicine of systematic correspondence, as we're going to see soon in our future lessons. So we can just think about that and think about how this all relates to the the ideas of what is right and wrong and how to behave and how to go with or against the proper ways of the world and the order of our body. Then you have Gu syndrome. This is another important concept from demonological medicine, and so it's Gu is sort of like worm spirits. They're like snakes, poisonous insects, bugs, evil toxins. They're like parasites, parasitic agents. Um, they transformed by demonological concepts and the influence of social experiences and developed into an explanatory model. If you look at the character, it's like a pot, it's like a vessel, and there are these nasty baddies in there. So these are like nasty insects or worms or creepy crawly guys, and they're in a pot together, kind of squirming all around and just, you know, what they would do to goo is actually something that was human created. They would create goo. It's like a poison by taking a bunch of poisonous insects, creatures, snakes. They would take mold or fungus, anything very toxic or poisonous to humans, and you would think would create illness. Perhaps they would put it all in a pot and let it consume each other until there was nothing left, just one super big baddie that was like rotting in the pot, and let that just go for a while. And then when you go back in there, it's like there is something really bad in there. That's like a super, super duper poisonous thing. And they would use that as a poison. So people were poisoning one another. It's like this pre-modern bioterrorism. It's this crazy phenomenon. You can read about it. There's some really interesting videos by Lorraine Wilcox, who's a really great scholar of Chinese medicine classics, and she has some videos on YouTube about Gu syndrome that I definitely recommend watching if you're interested in Gu syndrome. And also Heiner Fruehauf is a scholar, and he has many things that he's written about modern interpretations of Gu syndrome, which gives a really unique, fresh perspective. Some of those resources are in our lesson, this lesson in Populi for those of us taking the course for the Yuan. But he talks about how we can kind of think about Gu syndrome as sort of like this parasitic lingering pathogen. And so, post-viral disorders, people these days, I kind of sort of think about long COVID as a type of Gu syndrome. And, so these ideas, all of these demonological ideas, even though they develop in a different reality as our own, they can very interestingly and creatively be applied to problems of the modern era. They aren't necessarily no longer relevant. And I think that a perfect example of this is how Heiner Fruehauf is using Gu syndrome to create formulas for lingering pathogens. He uses it for like Lyme disease type stuff, Epstein-Barr type things. I wrote something about Gu syndrome for long COVID. So, yeah, these are just modern ways, along with the Worsley 5-element acupuncture way of applying possession and the acupuncture usages of the ghost points and demonological ideas in acupuncture. These are ways that demonological medicine, even up to the present era, is still a part of the plurality and the syncretistic practice of East Asian medicine. It doesn't go away. It always remains, and it's always an influential factor throughout all of history of the medicine. So, in conclusion, Demonological medicine was heavily influenced by the socio-realities of the times, and many different forms of medicine were developed with this worldview in mind. Various other forms of demonological medicine, or Wu shamanism practices, still exist today and are widely practiced, and in many cases they've subsequently been syncretized with Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist thoughts and ideas. Um, when you talk about somebody like Sun Simiao, he was influenced by demonological medicine. He was influenced by Buddhism. He was influenced by Taoism and Confucianism. So there's a very heavily syncretized um, set of ideas. And even though they don't all agree with each other, just like I said before, how the demonological medicine disagrees with some of the natural philosophy ideas, they still all exist within one another in the same box. Demonological concepts continue to be present and influential in East Asian medicine up to the present day. For example, modern treatments for possession, modern interpretations of Gu syndrome, and other demonological concepts have been transmitted to us, such as the 13 ghost points of Sun Simiao. This is often used for psychogenic disorders. It also exerts influences on herbal medicine concepts found in the Materia Medica and general herbal medicine literature. Demonological medicine exerts a unique, novel, syncretistic influence on the pluralism found within East Asian medicine to the present day, and understanding its influence can shed light on concepts and tools which are still commonly used in modern acupuncture clinics, even if they are used differently today than they were in the time when they were first developed. So that is our lecture today on demonological medicine and the Zhou dynasty. I hope that this was an informative lecture on a topic that is a little bit still quite far removed from the way that we see perhaps reality today, or maybe you might find that you resonate with these ideas. And so this is an important aspect of the pluralism of East Asian medicine. And in our next lectures, we're going to learn a little bit about much different ideas, which are going to become very relevant as the natural philosophy and the philosophies of Confucianism and Taoism really begin to take root and come into their own. And we're going to see how that happens in the next lecture. And I'm looking forward to really exploring some of those ideas, because I feel like even though demonological medicine is one of the most important aspects of East Asian medicine in many ways, I think the true heart and foundation of what we conceive of as East Asian medicine really truly comes from what Zhou calls the medicine of systematic correspondence. So we're going to be looking at all these different things. We're going to be looking at these ideas in the next few lectures. So check them out if you enjoyed the past couple lectures, and I will be seeing you there. Thanks so much.